It's cool to be at this meetup, having joined a few times. Super happy to be on the stage talking to you about how to shift left. So, like Cap said, I work with her together in the developer relations team at Sanity. I'm also an accessibility specialist. I've been spending a lot of my time on accessibility in the last decade, and most recently at the W3C, working on some accessibility standard promotion. So you'll hear a bit about accessibility standards today too. And yeah, let's dive right into it. So accessibility, let's talk about what it is. Let's then talk about how you can apply it. And then, yeah, look a bit at kind of how you can do it earlier as well, because that's the subject of today's talk. So web accessibility is all about making sure that people with disabilities can use your website. And that means that they can do stuff on your website that everyone else does, like buy your product or use your service. It just kind of has to work for people. And people with disabilities is a broad group. Sometimes people think that accessibility is about a specific group, like blind people or people who are deaf. But it is a really wide range of different people. Counting 1 in 5 of people in the world fall under this umbrella. And there's a lot of different kind of people that have disabilities and that we want to improve the web for. So it could be neurological conditions, motor impairments, color blindness, all these sorts of things. And I think what's more important than the particular disability that they have is kind of how they use the web. So some people might be using Zoom on web pages all the time. They might be using high contrast modes or a screen reader. They might need their audio or video transcribed. Sometimes they just use a keyboard, not a mouse, or some other device. They might be using voice recognition or prefer reduced motion. So lots of different ways that people use computers. And basically, to do accessibility is to make sure that the website or an app doesn't have barriers for those kinds of different ways of using computers. And basically, that all comes down to assuming less about how people use your product. I remember when first phones with the web came out, and I was still building websites that fit exactly on a 800 by 600 screen or maybe slightly bigger. And I had assumed that no one would be trying to do that on a phone. But then the iPhone came out and boom, we had to kind of make sites that were responsive, and we could make less assumptions about widths. Now, accessibility is a lot like that, but in a lot of different facets, right? And I want to talk about sort of what to test, because this might sound a kind of abstract, like there are so many different ways to use a computer. How can we make sure that our stuff actually works for all these different ways? Now, what I usually recommend is to look at 3 different things. One is accessibility standards, 2 is best practices, and then there is user testing. So those 3 things kind of have to be used together in order to get a super accessible experience. I'll focus on accessibility standards first. And specifically the WCAG standard. Now, this standard is internationally implemented, which means that governments worldwide have adopted this standard. So when the US government or the European Commission or most governments around the world really ask you to make a website accessible, what they usually do is ask you to meet the WCAG standard. So that's great. That's one standard that we can use across the globe. You can read it in its original form, which is the URL displayed on this slide, and I will be sharing the slides out later, so you can access all the URLs that I mentioned here. You can also use this different version called Quick Reference, where you get a bit of a easier view on the document. It makes it a bit easier to filter and to look around the different parts of the standard. There are also some derivative standards like thisiswcag.com, which tries to make a human readable form. Those documents are super helpful too if you want to try and understand the standard and get some more helpful examples. But note that they are not the official thing. So yeah, if you're trying to find out what you need to do exactly, you always want to refer back to the original, basically. Now, there's a lot to WCAG, different layers and different levels, but basically what it comes down to for most websites is that they meet 50 success criteria. So there are 50 things that are all about people who, or about issues that people with disabilities have with websites, like barriers that they might face. And they are testable, sometimes by humans, sometimes by machines. That's what they've all been designed like. So each of the 50 criteria will meet those criteria themselves. So yeah, accessibility standards, best practices, and user testing are what you'll need to do accessibility. And I'll not go into best practices and user testing today. I'll go straight to how to test this stuff. And many of you will have heard that you can do some of this automatically, but usually you'll need both. You'll need manual checks as well as automated checks. I'll give you one example. Like when you have an image that has 50% off, what you'll notice that this needs to have an alt attribute that gives an alternative. So if I used a computer or machine to check whether it is accessible, it could throw an error because it could find that that attribute is missing. But when the attribute is there, but it has the wrong contents, like it says 25% off, then someone will get the wrong information about what the deal is, and maybe they decide not to purchase, or stuff could happen. But the alt attribute is there, and this is something that automated test will not catch for you. Not because we can't automate this. I mean, OCR has existed for a long time, so it would be possible in theory, but just most accessibility testing services don't do any OCR, right? So this is usually something that you will be checking manually. Now let's look at a bunch of different ways of doing manual testing, and then look at some ways to do it automatically. I'll go through these kind of quickly, and I'll be sharing the slides later, so you can refer to them later on as well. So one check you can do is for the page title. You want to check if there is a title in the first place, and then also if it describes the page. So if you were to close your eyes and someone would describe the page using the title element, does it give you enough information about what's on that page? Because that's what you're looking for there. Another one is keyboard. Can you get to all the interactive elements? And that's elements like links and buttons, form elements. You want to be able to get there with the tab key and then use a space or an enter key to actually activate it. So anything that you can click on with a mouse, you also want it to be usable with just the keyboard. Another question to ask with keyboard is, can I actually see where I am? So let's say I have some text with some links in them. When you press the tab key, it will usually draw an outline around the link that you're currently on. Now, some websites turn that off, and that's an actual criteria in WCAG. You want to make sure that there is some kind of visual outline so that it's visible which element currently has focus, because that means if you're using a keyboard and you're going to press your enter key, it means you're going to go to that link and not another one. So that's very essential information. Now, when it comes to images, you want to figure out if the image is the only thing inside of a link. And that is often the case when you have a header with like a logo that links back to the homepage, because the alternative text for that image will become the link name. You want to make sure that it has some information about where it's going. So in this case, it will go to the homepage. So you want to have the word homepage in the alternative text. That's something that you can check there, because it will become part of the link's name and get announced by screen readers. Then audio. So when you have audio, you also want to make it available as text. And that's something that Darice Takuba, a friend of mine, has described quite beautifully in her blog post about an experiment she's done with students. She's a really big podcast lover, but as she's deaf, a lot of the podcasts that she wants to access are actually inaccessible because they don't provide alternative text, like no transcripts, or it takes some weeks. So she's kind of behind the season from her friends, maybe that she want to discuss them with. When it comes to headings, you want to check if they describe the section that they're heading off. And that's because a lot of people who use screen readers will navigate by heading. And you want to make sure they're actually marked up as headings as well in your HTML. We just saw a bit about Tailwind, and I won't give my opinions on Tailwind, but what often happens with Tailwind is that you can do everything with class names. So you could use a div instead of a heading element and get the same results visually. But in order for accessibility to work, you want an actual heading tag. Then when it comes to zoom, you want to zoom in like 400% and figure out, does everything still work? Like text shouldn't overlap, text shouldn't be cut off, all of the controls should be usable, and you don't want like horizontal and vertical scrolling at the same time. So that's a check that you can do like while you're developing and making sure none of your controls overlap, especially hard when you're doing like UI development. Another one is timing. So when you have anything that takes time, like a time limit of like an hour before you log someone out automatically, like in a banking application or something, you want to give them a chance to actually extend the time so that they have enough time to do the stuff they need to do. And that's especially important for people who are using different input methods that might take more time to use. For instance, if they're using a stick to control a keyboard rather than their fingers, or that sort of thing. Now let's look at a couple of ways to do semi-automated testing, so tests that you can run on your web page. And you can use Firefox DevTools for some of these. For instance, you can visualize the tabbing order with a checkbox in the accessibility tab. And that's really neat because that gives you an overview of what is tabbable on your page and also what the order is. So you want to make sure that the order kind of makes sense, that you don't go from the top to the bottom back to the top all the time. So you want to have like a logical order there. Firefox DevTools also comes with contrast and keyboard text label checks, and you can simulate color deficiencies, which is really helpful. If you can see the difference between red and green, you can see what it will look like if you wouldn't, and figure out if your colors work the way they should. Another tool that I love using for accessibility testing is actually the HTML validator. Gone are the times that we would display like a HTML tag on our websites that shows like, hey, we're valid. But it's still super helpful to figure out if there are any kind of problems that could also trickle down into screen readers and stuff like that. Sometimes these are also built into your framework. Like in React, I think the tool will also complain when you do wrong nesting and stuff like that. Another tool you can use in a browser is the Wave plugin. It's going to give you a lot of accessibility checks and let you browse kind of what sort of headings you have and that sort of thing. So Wave is another tool that you can use on your website, semi-automated. And then there's stuff that you can run fully automated. And a lot of these can integrate with like your CI/CD, or you can like run it on a pull request, stuff like that. Now, examples are Axe, Tenon, and Siteimprove, but there are a bunch more. If you want to dive into that, I recommend this blog post by the UK government, because they've looked at a bunch of different automated tests and figured out like what they are testing and if they are catching the problems that they are describing, basically. Now, I promised to explain why it is easier if you do it earlier. And I think the main reason for that is that you can find barriers in your site before it deploys. And I think that is a really helpful thing, whether it's for yourself or for your clients that you're building a Sanity website for. It's usually quite expensive to find out about accessibility problems after your website launches. This is what I used to do when I did accessibility audits. I'd often be asked, our website is done, can you do an audit? But the problems I found would be kind of expensive to fix because they would have to get the team back together. Maybe they are already working on some new features and they kind of need to go back to some of the older stuff. It isn't very helpful. So if you can find problems earlier, that is helpful. It's easier when you do it earlier if you pick a CMS that supports accessibility, if you check your designs before building them, if you check your builds before merging them, and also if you check the merged code before shipping it. Lots of ways to do stuff earlier and to kind of bring the accessibility earlier on. Now, what does that look like in Sanity? Because we're at the Sanity Meetup, right? Now, one of the things that Sanity does is that it has a WYSIWYM editor rather than WYSIWYG. We kind of do what you see is what you mean. So rather than saying I want a heading that is bold and uses this font, you basically say this is a heading, and then in the front end, someone can figure out what to render it as. And this is really important for accessibility because you want to use the right tags. I'll get into that a bit more in a minute. Another thing that you can kind of do with Sanity is have better color contrast when it comes to images that you're using by using the palette feature that the Image API offers. So I've been building this personal photo blogging thing where it shows photos of where I currently am. Like here is a photo of Rotterdam where I live. And you'll see that the header has the same color as the photo, or kind of the main color of the photo is in the header. You see the Panda one has got a red header, for instance. Now the way that I do that, and let's actually go to my vision tool and we'll look for the posts, find the alt attributes so you can know what they are. And then from the image, we'll grab the asset reference and then get the metadata from there. Now, inside of that, I have put a palette property that has the colors that belong to this photo. Now, this palette stuff is generated by Sanity, or tool that Sanity uses, and it's going to return you a bunch of different colors that you can use in the front end. Now, that's what I'm using for my headers to give them the same color. but it also comes with stuff like a title color that will be black or white, depending on what the background color is. And with that, you can figure out ways to, let's say you want to have enough contrast between your foreground and background, you can find colors that kind of do that. And I'm saying kind of because it can sometimes give you colors that don't have exactly the WCAG requirement for contrast. That has to do with how many colors are in your picture, because it uses the color data from your photo in order to generate that palette. So if you don't have a lot of colors, it's a little bit harder to generate that. But in many cases, it will give you the right color, and you can tweak that in your front end as well by like having a little bit of semi-transparency or stuff like that. Now, you probably have seen that last month we launched the developer preview for V3. Espen is going to talk about this a bit more in the next talk. But when we announced it, we said, make it yours, because one of the cool things about V3 is that it is even more customizable. And customizability is actually something I find really interesting for accessibility too. Because if you want Sanity as your CMS that lets you do accessibility earlier and make accessibility easier, then customization is actually really helpful. And one way that I've looked at that is by adding validation rules. Now, this is not something V3 specific, although I built it in V3. And yeah, I want to show you kind of what this looks like. So I have got a book review, and in the book review, I've got headings and lists, but the headings are not true headings because they're bold text, and the lists are basically separated by returns. And then I've got a link there that's called click here, which isn't super helpful link text. So to find problems like that, problems that I've made as a demo, I have added 3 validation tests that are going to find these problems for me. Now, the first one is to find the fake headings. So it's looking for bold text that is the only child of like a paragraph. That's usually a heading. So what we're going to warn is, hey, this looks like a heading, but it's bold text. Now, if you want to fix that, you just pick a heading from the list and you turn it into like an actual semantic heading. Now let's do the list one. So we're uncommenting that, and now it's going to flag that list that I've got there, because it's not a real list, right? It's just separated by returns. Now, if I turn that into a list with bullets, and that's bullets visually here, but we can display it any way we like, then we'll see that that actually gets applied. Well, let's change this heading as well so that it's a real heading. Now, the last problem we have there is this text, click here. That's not descriptive. We want something more descriptive like publisher's website. And the reason is that if you're using a screen reader, it's going to read out the names of the link, but not necessarily what's before it. So it says to buy it, click here. But you want here to buy it, then you just here click here, and it's not helpful. So we want to change that into something else, like publisher's website, for instance. And when we do that, we see that it's no longer flagged as an error. So what I'm doing there is I'm looking at an array of different strings like click here, learn more, read more, those sorts of generic link text that we want to avoid. And then I just check if the link text is that or something better, and fire a warning. So yeah, these are just a couple of ways that you can use validation rules. There are basically just JavaScript functions that you run on the text that is inside of your portable text editor. And then you can help editors to get stuff right. And this may be a little annoying when you're an editor and you get these warnings all the time, but it's also something you get used to. I mean, I can empathize with it when I started using TypeScript and I get all the different errors because I wasn't aware of some of the stuff. And then suddenly I learned how it works, and yeah, I get less errors. So that's kind of the idea of that. Like when you do make mistakes, they are flagged, and that is helpful. I even make these kinds of mistakes myself when I'm working with text and not in auditor mode, basically, when I don't have my auditor hat on, and I imagine it's the same for everyone. Now, another example of where you can leverage Sanity is if you're building a multilingual website, like this website that I've built for a British band. So they are English from Bristol, UK, but they sing in Chinese. So their website is bilingual and all of the content is on one page. So there's no language switch. You just get both of the languages. Now, what that looks like is that, because it's side by side, we're declaring in the HTML element have a lang attribute that says the whole content is in English. And then inside of the heading, for instance, we have some Chinese text and we're marking that with another lang attribute that says this text is actually in Chinese. So we have a lang attribute on the body and another one on the span, or like any content you see here will be marked with a lang attribute. In this case, it's Chinese Taiwan because they perform a lot in Taiwan, and their Chinese is specific to the way it is used in Taiwan. So you're using a language tag to basically tag this content is in this language. And with these two lang attributes, we're actually covering two success criteria from WCAG, one for the whole document, which is the one on the HTML element, and another one where there is a change of language. Now, in portable text, we can do this with custom annotations. And that's something our awesome community member, Kitty Giordell, has done this week. They showed this in a blog post, so I won't be talking about it too much. You can check out their blog post, it's more clear. But basically, they've created a custom annotation which adds a language switch to their portable text editor. So you can select some text and say, I want this to be in this language, and then they render it as a span with that lang attribute available. Now, I love this. I think this kind of annotation-y things are really cool because they allow you to add that accessibility meta information that is needed because the accessibility guidelines say that it is needed, or some users can benefit from it, and this lets editors make those changes. So yeah, I think that's really cool, being able to customize in order to improve accessibility. All right, so we've looked at what accessibility is, how you can apply it with different tools, and when, preferably early with the right CMS with automated checks, often during your development and periodically as well with audits and user tests and stuff like that. All right, with that, I want to thank you very much. The slides are available on my website. I'll tweet them out probably or share them in the chat later on.
Awesome, and I'm not muted. I will leave this slide up for a little bit so you all can jot that down real quick. Thank you, Hidde. What a great talk with a lot of information about accessibility. I know that this talk used to be longer, and so for you to be able to get all this information in 20 minutes, super great.
Yeah, I shared the links afterwards, so you can dive into some more because yeah, I've had to cut out some nuances here and there.
I didn't know about the manual zoom going up to 400%. That's actually something very interesting. So when they zoom into 400, is that like the minimum, or is it like where did that 400 come from? Like, it's
basically a bit of a random amount. There's, I think, the standard says 200% for some stuff, and then some more. I use 400 because it often breaks some stuff, and it's useful to find out kind of where it's breaking. So I actually have a friend who is like visually impaired, and they use their phone on like 400%. So everything is really big. It's mostly annoying for them when they want to send a private text message, and they need to make sure people are not staring at their screen. On phones, this is kind of easy to do, but on websites, it often breaks stuff because some button might overlap with some other button, or some text might overlap with some other text. So yeah, I use 400% because it usually allows me to find all the problems basically. And more is probably overdoing it. And some browsers also only go up to 400. So yeah.
Well, because I usually do like 1 to 200, like if I'm doing a demo and I need to zoom in or something like, but 400, I think that's probably something I'll strive for, like, especially when I'm sharing, but like try and get up higher. Cause yeah, you just don't think, but yeah, 400 is a great number to strive for. I learned something the other day when I said grok in one of my videos, that the captioning picked it up as GROK. And so the person listening and reading the captioning didn't know what I was talking about, because when they Googled it, GROK didn't come up with anything for Sanity because it spelled GROQ. And so I learned something. And so like, if you ever have feedback for stuff that like content that's being created, the creator loves to hear this kind of stuff because it helps them improve their content. So it's just like,
yeah, it's usually recommend like to spell out, but I don't always do it either. Like with WCAG, I will not say WCAG. I probably should, because yeah, it does help some people Googling afterwards for sure.
Yeah. So there were a couple of questions while you were speaking. A lot of folks tend to think about accessibility in terms of permanent disabilities. Can you talk a little bit how thinking/caring about accessibility can help folks who have temporary disabilities or situations and provide like universal clarity for that?
Yeah, so there are some organizations that will look at situational versus temporary versus permanent. Where
Okay.
situational is like you're holding a baby and you only have one hand available. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Like that's
Yes.
hard. And suddenly you realize like, oh, I can't reach that thing with my thumb only. So that's situational. Or you're in a bar and the sound of the music is really loud and it's harder to order something. It's easier to point at the written down menu or something like that. That's kind of situational. And then there's temporary too, where maybe I've cut my finger while I'm cooking and my hand cannot use it for a bit, but I can use it like in 2 months. I might also experience what it's like to use just a keyboard or struggle with the mouse or stuff like that. Broken your arm is another kind of common one. If people go and do a skiing holiday or something and come home and temporarily can't use some parts of their body. So yeah, that's definitely widens the group too of people who benefit from accessible websites.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't think about like the temporary and the situational kind of stuff. So, yeah, all this like testing and like researching is good to have. Do the accessibility standards cover all disabilities currently?
They don't. So they kind of cover the ones that are easiest to turn into rules. And some of them are a lot harder to turn in rules. One is cognitive accessibility. When I worked at W3C, there's this working group that worked specifically on that, but it's really hard to take some of their work into rules because it's very personal. Like some of the problems are harder to kind of translate into rules that can be applied universally. So cognitive disabilities are one aspect that are a bit harder to put into the rules. A lot of the guidelines are about accessibility for people who are blind. And that is because that's kind of technical what you need to do there, because it corresponds to like the accessibility APIs and all that sort of thing. So it's a bit easier to turn into the guidelines or the success criteria that are in the standard.
I see. Cool. And we have another question from the community. How is your expertise in accessibility helping to improve Sanity?
Right. I am sometimes in meetings with some of the engineers who are working on cool new stuff to help with some of the accessibility things there. That is starting to happen, and yeah, there's lots of different parts where like I will get involved and kind of I'd give advice to colleagues. Because this is something I'm passionate about. So I share a lot of this stuff internally as well.
Yeah, and it's just the fact that it's brought up and it's talked about and you teach it and you talk about it that helps people every day. You may not be making major changes to the studio or to something, but now all the engineers or content creators, anyone that is using Sanity now gets to hear what you have to say and learn about 400% manual zoom or, the situational disabilities. But yeah, it's so good to hear about this stuff and be constantly reminded. This is definitely a talk that you can revisit in a couple months and get something else, or maybe you forgot about something. So yeah, thank you for sharing.
Thanks for having me.
So if any of you have any other questions for Hidde, you can find Hidde in the Slack community. And yeah, thank you so much. And we will see you around, Hidde.
Thanks. Bye.